In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, Michelle, if you don't mind just putting that in one more time, just in case anyone just joined about the audio. I know we are having some folks with issues yesterday, so I want to make sure everyone can hear me. We'll also be posting this webinar recording as well as the slides to our website in the next week or so. So if for some reason you hop off today, feel free to watch that at a later date. So my name is Kara Runston. I am the MVP Program Manager here at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And I'm excited to tell you today about our upcoming grant opportunities through the MVP program. So here is a map with our 6 regions as well as our regional coordinators and their contact information. If all the RCs could just kind of give a wave, I'm not going to have them go around and introduce themselves, but I'm sure many of you have met them before, and if you haven't, please reach out to them. They'd love to make your acquaintance. And then Carolyn Mecklenburg is going to run your chat questions today. So you'll be hearing from her a little bit later on. So agenda, I'm going to give just a very brief overview of the MVP program, some details on the planning grant round that's coming up, as well as the action grant round. And then we're going to do some Q&A. Quick housekeeping notes, we will be recording this session. And also, please use the chat box for your questions. We're going to keep everyone on mute throughout the entire webinar. Some of you may have seen a little earlier in the year that we had a security breach on one of our webinars, so we're just taking some extra precautions by doing that this time. So, before I get into the definition on this slide, I just wanted to give a little more context about the MVP program. So the MVP program came about after Governor Baker signed Executive Order 569 in 2016 that set forth a plan to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase preparedness in the Commonwealth on both the state and the local level. And then the MVP program is one of the ways that we're implementing that on the local level. So on the slide is our working definition of climate resilience through the MVP program. So it's the ability of a community to address the needs of its built, social, and natural environment to anticipate, cope with, and rebound stronger from events and trends related to climate change hazards. And the key here is really the continuously building capacity piece. We're looking for really proactive projects that respond to future climate conditions, not reactive ones that are responding to current conditions. So this slide just gives a little overview of our 2 types of grants. I'll go over both the planning and action grants. I'll try to keep the planning grant pretty brief because I know most of you are here for the action grant phase, but if you are new to the MVP program, the main thing I want you to take away from today's session is to connect with your regional coordinator, and they'd be happy to explain the whole program, how to get involved in the planning grant stage if you're one of those 39 municipalities that are not yet in the program, and they can really help you make sure that you're ready to submit an application for this round for the planning grant. Planning grants are sort of the starting point, the entryway into the MVP program. They roughly range between $15,000 and $30,000 per plan, and you have 1 fiscal year to complete your plan. You are able to apply for an expanded scope if you want to do some additional outreach, say to an environmental justice community, or there's another task that would help with your planning process. There's some opportunity for additional funds for that. And we have about $1 million available per year through the planning grant program. And I'll talk a little more about the steps of the planning grant program in a second. So action grants are the next phase of the MVP grant program. So once you have your plan and the actions you'd like to take to increase resilience in your community, you can apply for action grants to implement those actions. The action grants are open to those who have completed the planning process and have been designated as an MVP community. And you can apply for up to $2 million per project, or $5 million if it's a regional project. And you can apply for either 1 or 2 years of funding through the action grant program. We have about $10 million available per year for the action grant program. Here is a slide that just shows the MVP program status to date. So we're really proud that we have 89% participation across the Commonwealth. That means that 89% of communities have either already completed the planning process or are currently undertaking the planning process. And that's all the different shaded communities on this map. The dots represent action grants that are going on or have been completed, and there's about 160 of those, so lots of work going on. And we have awarded about $44 million to date through the MVP program. We conducted an evaluation in the fall of this year. You may have participated in that, where we asked folks questions mostly focused on improvements to the action grant RFR and application and opportunities for more shared learning and learning what people would like to see in that space. So we had both a survey where we got 191 responses, and we also had 2 focus groups with participants, including municipal staff and others. And obviously we learned a lot through all of these different avenues, but some of the main takeaways I've posted at the bottom of the slide here. One is that there's really overwhelming support for a pre-application process for action grants. So we did pilot this round, an expression of interest that some of you may have participated in. We got, I think, almost 160 different project ideas submitted through that. So that was really exciting. And there's a lot of great potential project ideas out there already, which is great. That was an optional step this round, so you don't have to have submitted an EOI to then submit an application, but we're looking to provide people feedback on their ideas before the formal application is released. We also identified some confusion over our current project types, or the ones from last round, as well as the scope budget template, and I'll talk about how we're addressing that in a bit. There was support for MVP highlighting projects that increase social resilience as part of their applications. I'll talk about that in a bit as well. And then stakeholders would find more webinars and case studies helpful. We did host a series of webinars over the past couple months that you may have been a part of. There were topics such as regional partnerships, environmental justice and equity, and community engagement, and nature-based solutions. And all of the links to those webinars are on our website. I'll post our website link a little bit later, but definitely go check those out if you haven't seen those yet. We had the project teams talking about their projects, so it was really useful to learn about those that are working on the projects every day. So now I'll talk a little more about the planning grant opportunity. I did also want to pause and just say that our request for responses and applications for this next round are currently undergoing review by senior staff at EEA. So everything I say here, just take with a grain of salt. This is what you can expect, but definitely refer to the RFRs when they're out as the be-all end-all of what's in them. So here's a slide that talks about the process of planning grants. Planning grants center on workshops, community workshops with stakeholders, where they identify the climate hazards that the community is gonna face. They identify the vulnerabilities in town based on those hazards, and then actions that they would like to take to reduce those vulnerabilities. They come up with a plan, and then they're designated as an MVP community and eligible for action grant funding. You'll hire a state-trained MVP provider to take you through that process. So you'll have lots of support along the way, including from your regional coordinator as well. I wanted to point out that ensuring diverse representation of your community in the workshops, as well as the public listening session that's part of the planning grant, is really, really key here. So think about how to encourage stakeholders like members of environmental justice neighborhoods, community-based organizations, local businesses, neighborhood groups, et cetera. Think about how to bring them to the table and what would be most effective there. Successful action grant projects really come from the whole community and not just municipal staff priorities. So that's a really important thing to think about even at the planning grant stage. I also wanted to share a paraphrased quote from a DPW director at a CRB workshop, Community Resilience Building workshop, which is part of the planning grant process, that we attended a few weeks ago. And that person said, yes, there's a lot of infrastructure I want to fix, but I also know there's a lot of other sources out there for funding those things. I'm interested in learning more about the socioeconomic and environmental issues in town to see what else we can work on. So I thought that was a really great quote. It showed more of like a holistic view and what the MVP program is really looking for. Yes, we do fund infrastructure sometimes, but we're also looking at these other elements and community priorities as well. So I wanted to put an exemplary planning grant process example on the screen here. This is Amherst's process from 2019. They took a unique approach to the outreach components of their planning grant process that really benefited the overall result. They hired a community liaison or someone from an underrepresented group in their town to conduct outreach to those traditionally underrepresented in these processes. And they increased access by providing translation and interpretive services, childcare, and food for 8 community gatherings. They indicated that families that attended these events were entirely new to Amherst planning efforts, and this really helped to benefit their overall plan, and then ended up leading to an action grant where they're doing a further kind of community plan on resilience. So this was a great process. You are able to request extra funding to do this type of intensive outreach, and we really encourage that. So details and timeline for the planning grant. Again, we have about $1 million available. They are upfront payments for the planning grant, unlike action grants that are reimbursable. There's an hourly match requirement, but that's the only match requirement, so municipal or volunteer staff time devoted to the process. And then applications will be submitted by email to me like they were last year. This is going to differ from the action grant process, so I just wanted to note that. And then the RFR will be released at the very end of March, and applications due early June, with an award announcement hopefully as soon into the fiscal year as possible, so July or August, with projects starting after that and projects ending at the end of the fiscal year. So here are some of the application components for the planning grant. The cover sheet is the, and also the application are both required, and those are in the RFR. And then there's a bunch of other components that I'm not going to go into all of them, but a signed letter of support from a top municipal official, statement of commitment, name and qualifications of a municipal project lead, and letters of support, and a few other things. It's a pretty short and concise application, but definitely reach out to your regional coordinator if you have any questions about anything on this list. So now I'm going to move on to action grants. I always like to start talking about action grants by talking about our MVP core principles. There's 9 of them that are listed on the screen. I'll talk about a few of them that we always like to highlight. One is that we're looking for proactive solutions that are supported by climate data. So again, looking for those proactive approaches, not reactive. We also prioritize nature-based solutions, or those that leverage nature for its climate resiliency benefits. We prioritize projects that improve equitable outcomes for and support strong partnerships with environmental justice communities, as well as those that have robust community engagement elements. And also those that are regional in nature, because we know that climate change does not respect jurisdictional boundaries. And then we also like to see innovative kind of demonstration projects and those that are transferable to other communities. So those are a few of the things that we like to see. And When you're thinking about your project idea, really think about how it might fit into these MVP core principles, and that's how you'll know how competitive it's going to be for the MVP action grant process. So I wanted to give a little bit of background about some statistics from last round, just to give some more information. We know the action grant process has gotten more and more competitive over the past few years. Last year, we got 142 applications and over $46 million requested through those applications. We were able to fund 41 projects, and the total funding was around $10.5 million. The average grant size was around $250,000. And I mentioned earlier, for the expression of interest process that we are piloting this round, we got 160 project ideas. So I think we can expect that this round will be just as competitive, or maybe more so, than last round. So I wanted to go into some details and timeline for the action grant as well. Again, we have about $10 million available through the action grant program. There is a 25% match, local match, that's required of the total project cost, and that can be from any non-state funding source. If you have questions about that, feel free to ask us. Action grants are reimbursable, so you'll complete tasks and deliverables, send those to your RC, and then get reimbursed for them. And there's some templates and things that you'll have to fill out to do that. Action grants will be submitted by an online form this year. We hope that will streamline things for everybody. I'll show you an example of what that will look like a little later on. And the RFR will be released again, probably the very end of March, with applications due around 6 weeks after release for the action grants. Award announcement also hopefully as soon into the fiscal year as possible, and then projects starting after that. You again can apply for 1 or 2 years of funding if you have a project that merits 2 years of funding. We did want to leave that option available still this round. A few other things. Make sure that if you're applying for 2 years, you have distinct phases between the 2 years. Sometimes we're only able to fund for the first year and not the second, so it's important to be able to have kind of distinct phases in your project broken out that way. Remember to ask any specific questions about project ideas before the RFR is released. We can't talk about specific projects after that date, so it's really important to get any questions answered before that. And then also, please make sure all the components of your project go together in a coherent way. Don't apply for 2 different projects in the same application. That just makes it really confusing for reviewers and everybody in the process. So what's new in this FY22 round? There's a few things. One of the main things is our new online application submittal. I'll talk about that in a bit. We've also revised our eligible project types. I will also talk about those. We've revised some of our scoring criteria to include more instruction on what types of information to include for each project type. So while the main buckets of the questions that are in the application are going to be the same pretty much as last round, the specific questions and details that we're looking for within them are going to be a bit more specific this round. So unfortunately, it's not going to be a copy-paste job from your application last round to this round. There will be other things that we need to consider under each of these buckets. So definitely take a look closely at all of the information in the application. We've also revised the scope and budget template a little bit. I'll show you that. One of the biggest things that I hope people are excited about, and definitely we're responding to feedback on this. The second tab on the spreadsheet, that's really complicated kind of budget spreadsheet, is now going to be optional. If you have more details on your budget in another format, feel free to provide that with your application, but that really complicated table will just be optional if it's helpful for people. We'll also have a new optional bonus point for projects in any phase that include physical assets that will help support piloting the beta Resilient Massachusetts Action Team RMAT Climate Resilience Design Standards tool. I'll talk about that in a moment. then we'll have some revamped appendices to give you some more information and project examples and other funding sources. So here are our updated project types. The first one is going to look very similar to last round's project type, but we did add the word capacity building in here. And that's really getting at that desire for more social resiliency type projects that we heard about in the feedback. So you can think about capacity building activities as things like educational campaigns, equity workshops, identification and fostering relationships with potential partners like community-based organizations, and other activities that really kind of increase adaptive capacity within the community. We also will have two other buckets that more closely align with project phasing. So design and permitting, and then construction and on-the-ground implementation, which could include things like construction or land acquisition, installing an energy resilience project, planting trees, those types of kind of tangible things that we can see on the ground every day. So these are the new project types, again, more closely aligning with the project phases. So we hope between the core principles that are sort of our scoring criteria and the project types, it's more clear what the distinction is there. And hopefully your project can fit nicely into one of these buckets. That was kind of the goal. I also wanted to note that sometimes people wonder where like feasibility studies for interventions at particular sites go. That would be the first bucket, the planning assessments and capacity building bucket. So here is a list of some application components for the action grant. Again, you'll complete an online form and you'll upload a lot of attachments through the form, including the application narrative, which is your answers to all the questions in the application, your Excel version of your scope and budget, and then some other additional attachments. So your MVP yearly progress report, if you have completed your planning process more than a year ago, that's required. The attachment for design, permitting, and construction projects, that was a new last round to make sure kind of our regulatory ducks are in a row. Statement of match, letters of support from the landowner, partners, and the public. I did want to pause here and just say that the more you can compile all of your letters of support into one PDF document and upload it to the application, the better. It's really hard if you send in support letters to my email or other, at other times that is not like with the application. It's hard to make sure that they're going to actually be with your application. So the more you can compile them and upload them as one document, that will make everyone's lives, I think, a lot easier. We also will have that attachment about the climate resilient design standards tool that I'll talk about. And then if you're doing land acquisition projects, there is some requirement for a draft town meeting or city council vote language that will be outlined in the RFR. So what does the online submission form look like? So it's going to be similar to the EOI form, at least the same software, if you are familiar with that now. So there'll be some fields that you need to type directly into the form, like what's listed here. And then you'll also need to upload a bunch of attachments like I talked about on the previous slide. And you can do that here. One thing to note is that the total size of all of the attachments has to be less than 25 megabytes. So keep that in mind when you're compiling things. Another thing to note is I've highlighted at the bottom of the screen here, there's a save and resume later button. So you can save it and come back to the form later. It'll give you a link and you'll need to save that and make sure that you have that available when you want to re-access your application. If you save it and leave and come back later, it's not going to save the uploaded attachments. So make sure that you re-upload those when you come back. All of these instructions will be at the top of the form as well as in the RFR. So don't feel like you need to furiously take notes right now. It'll say that clearly at the top of the form for you. So here is our attachment B, scope and budget spreadsheet. Again, there's going to be instructions at the top of this form this time. That's kind of a new thing. So make sure you read all of those through and make sure you're following those instructions when you submit this. There's a few edits to the table itself. So you'll see there's now an approximate start date and an approximate end date. And then there's also breaking down the match between in-kind and cash just to get more details about that. Other things to know about this document is the task should be clearly defined with reasonable deliverables. If the project spans 2 fiscal years, there needs to be a clear distinction between the 2 years. Remember that because of our state capital funding source, our funding doesn't roll over from year to year. That's why extensions are extremely discouraged, because it actually takes funding out of the next year's grant round if you do need to extend your project. So anyway, we need to be really clear about what we're spending in each fiscal year to make sure we're maximizing our MVP grant dollars. Also, tasks must be complete to request reimbursement, as I mentioned. So if you need to be reimbursed throughout the fiscal year, please make sure your tasks, break them up in a manner that aligns with the schedule that you'd like to be reimbursed on. If you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to your regional coordinator and they'd be happy to assist. All right, so moving on to the Beta Climate Resilient Design Standards tool attachment. So this is new this year. It's an optional component. Help us pilot this beta tool. The Climate Resilient Design Standards tool is being created to provide consistent design criteria for climate adaptation projects at the state and local level for proposed projects that include design of physical assets, such as new or redeveloped buildings, coastal engineering structures, roads, etc. This is an online tool where the applicant will enter location and project-specific information, answer some questions to determine the risk levels based on climate parameters like heat, precipitation, and flooding. And then based on this information and data that's automatically pulled from Resilient MA, the project will receive scores for criticality and exposure to climate hazards. The tool will provide recommendations on the design criteria that include the planning horizon, return period, and standards for the design. So once you get all of that information, which is a lot, what do you do with it for the MVP application? So with the MVP application, you'll have an attachment that has some questions on it about what the results of the tool were, as well as your experience with the tool itself and how easy it was to use and things like that. So you'll answer those questions and also attach your printout to your application. And that is how you can get the bonus point for this, for using this tool. It's important to note that the tool is going to be released in early April, and it might not align exactly with the release of the RFR. So the URL that's going to be in the attachment is the URL that will have the live link when it's ready. You don't have to keep checking back on the URL. We'll make sure to notify people, hopefully through our MVP newsletter, that it's live, so you can kind of stay up to date on that way. So getting back to our competitive evaluation criteria. So these map onto the MVP core principles that I talked about earlier. So you'll see those reflected in this evaluation criteria. Again, the general buckets are the same as last time, but there are different details that we're asking for under each one. So make sure you read those carefully. We have a bucket for project description, rationale, and climate data like we did last time. Timeline, scope, and budget. And I already talked about some of the details about the budget, but again, if you are applying for 2 years, make sure that it's very distinct between the 2 years. I also wanted to note that probably approximately like 75% of our funding this round is going to be for work completed in FY22. So that's just important to think about if you do have a potential 2-year project. So we also have our bucket for nature-based solutions. And I just wanted to highlight, like, in more detail what some of these other questions might be that are under these buckets. So for nature-based solutions, I'm just going to give you an example. For project type 1, which is the planning, assessments, capacity building, and regulatory updates, we're going to want to know, how does this work set the stage for future implementation of nature-based solutions? For project type 2, which is design and permitting, we're going to want to know, we're going to want you to describe all of the design options, including the nature-based options that will be evaluated or considered through the design process. And for project type 3, which is construction and on-the-ground implementation, we're going to want to know what are the nature-based solutions being implemented. If the project is not nature-based, describe a clear assessment of design alternatives and discussion of why a nature-based solution was not chosen. And again, there will be a subset of points for hard infrastructure projects that have a solid answer to that question. So moving on to the environmental justice and public regional benefits bucket, I did also want to note here that in addition to describing the positive impacts to the environmental justice population, we're also going to want to see demonstrated support from that community. And that can take two forms. One is letters of support from community members and community-based organizations, or it could be the community liaison model. So where through the grant funding or the project, you're actually hiring a community liaison, which is somebody from an underrepresented group or from a community-based organization that's going to help with outreach and engagement in your project with those underrepresented groups. And if you do end up taking that approach, make sure you outline that here in this question, and specifically how much of the grant funding will be going towards those groups. We want to see them being compensated for their time. And then moving on to public involvement and community engagement, we will again have that table and narrative in there. It's important to note we're looking for effectiveness of strategies and not just number here. And then we also want to see these strategies in your scope and budget and not just mentioned here and not incorporated into your scope. So that's how you're going to get kind of full points in this area. For project transferability, measurement of success and maintenance, similar to last time, but I did want to note that the measurement piece here, we're actually looking for kind of directional outcomes, ways to measure things like reduction in flooding or increase in tree canopy. We're not just looking for kind of process metrics like our project was successful if it was completed on time and things like that. So moving on to the rest of them. So there's the need for assistance bucket, which will look similar to last time, project feasibility and management. One thing to note here is if you're going to have an ongoing MVP grant into FY22, this is where you really note your capacity to take on a new one. So make sure that that is included in this bucket. We have our overall project quality that's determined by reviewers, and then the potential for the bonus point if it's applicable to your project. So here's some projects that are not MVP competitive. I'm not, in the interest of time, going to walk through all of these, but if you have any questions on what's listed on this slide, it will also be in the RFR. Please reach out to us. And I also just wanted to run through a few action grant examples. These are all examples that were included in our winter webinar series. So I really encourage you to go and look at those webinars again to get some inspiration and learn more about these successful action grant projects. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into all of those because we do have other resources that you can look at. So the first one that I wanted to highlight was Great Barrington's FY21 Action Grant. Again, the links to the webinars are going to be on these slides and we'll post them. But they trained key town staff and stakeholders on climate justice, equity, and inclusion, and performed community outreach to climate vulnerable populations. So it's really exemplifying that MVP core principle through this project. Here is a Lakeville regional project with neighboring communities. They did a watershed management and climate action plan. It's really a holistic plan, again, regional in focus, and there's been lots of community engagement. So it highlights a lot of different MVP core principles through that project. Malden River Works. So this is really a model for engagement with EJ and climate vulnerable populations. Highly recommend listening to the webinar and them describing this project and the engagement that's been going on through the project. They've really focused on fostering strong partnerships from the beginning of the project. And also the project itself is kind of increasing access to green space and amenities while also providing climate resilience. So it's got lots of co-benefits going on. Here's the Falmouth project from FY19. This project brought together a lot of funding sources, a lot of partners to make a really broad impact on a large scale. It's a nature-based solution, lots of co-benefits as I talked about. So that's another great one to look into. So if you want to learn anything else about any MVP projects that have been done to date, we have this website that has deliverables and descriptions of the projects. The link is at the bottom of this slide. And then finally, some new resources. I mentioned our new website. That's the link, resilientma.org/MVP. That has a homepage with all kinds of information as well as links to those webinars. It also has links to toolkits that we've created on a few topics that are listed on this slide. And those toolkits are really designed for applicants to the MVP program, both the planning and action grant stage. So make sure to check those out. They should provide some good information and guidelines for applying to the program. And then also we will be launching a new interactive grant map viewer, and it should be launching this week or next week, but you'll be able to click around on a map and see the different projects that we've funded that way. So a kind of new interactive way to look at projects. So I'll leave the slide up here for a second. This is the contact information for the regional coordinators, but I did want to turn it over to Carolyn. I know I've been talking a lot, so I'll try to be quiet for a bit, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. If we don't get to your question, just follow up with your regional coordinator with an email, and we'll make sure we can answer it for you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kara. We've got a good handful of questions here from the chat, so thank you all for submitting those. I'll start with just some of the simpler ones. There was a question about if the slides are going to be made available. Yes, they will. We will be posting the recording of this webinar in addition to the slides after the webinars. Let's see. There was also a question about MVP designation and our MVP designation map that we showed at the beginning. If you're unsure about your municipality's status, please check in with your regional coordinator. That map was created in the fall, so there may have been some that have been finished up since then, where you would be able to apply for an action grant. We also had some questions about our core principles. So we had one that asked, given that general maintenance is not a competitive project, can we expand on or provide an example of the monitoring and maintenance core principle? Hillary, can I turn that question to you?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. Thanks, Carolyn. This was correct. Projects that are focused on maintaining existing infrastructure without consideration for future climate conditions are not competitive. So we want to see evidence in the application that the proposed project will be monitored and maintained moving forward to ensure the municipality is committed to the project in the long term. So an example for monitoring, if your project wants to reduce flooding, increase tree canopy cover, or reduce the risk of, say, sewer overflows, maybe there are different metrics that would be able to track and indicate whether this project is accomplishing these certain outcomes. As far as maintenance, I think one good example might be if you intend to install green stormwater infrastructure, you'll need to have an operations and maintenance plan and indicate how it would be carried out.
Great, thank you, Hillary. We had a question about one of the pieces of our application. In our last round, we had an attachment, and we will still have that attachment if you're submitting for a design, permitting, or construction type project. So the question was, is that form only required for some construction projects and not others? Again, this is a question that I would encourage you to reach out to your relevant regional coordinator for, since it seems pretty project specific. In general, that attachment is meant to encourage you to think through possible permitting requirements for any given project idea. So I would say it's better to fill it out to the best of your ability, even if you're not sure if it's super relevant. Better to fill than to leave it blank. But I would encourage you to check in with your regional coordinator. We'll have a question about, can a community submit more than one project application? And the answer is yes, a community can submit for more than one project, but there is a question on the application about municipal capacity, or management capacity, I should say. So it'll be important to indicate who will be managing different projects within the town and demonstrate that you do have the capacity to manage more than one project. So say, one department has submitted this application, another department will be working on this one, just to reiterate that you're able to manage multiple projects. On a similar note, can any municipal department or municipally owned facility submit an application? In general, yes, any municipal department can apply. The municipality must serve as the fiscal agent for the project. So if you have a more specific question, if there's like a quasi-public agency or something that you're confused about, again, please reach out to your regional coordinator for a more specific answer. Let's see, I'm playing a little bit of catch up here with some of our questions that have recently come in. I'm seeing a question about environmental justice. How is environmental justice defined within the MVP context? State guidelines reflect 2010 census data, which is quite dated at this point. Can the definition of EJ be expanded to include localized populations and other vulnerable populations? Let's see.
Yeah, I can take that one. So yes, our definition of environmental justice is based off of the 2017 EJ policy through EEA. We can provide some links to that if you're interested, but there's a viewer that helps you just type in your municipality and you can see whether there's any EJ populations in your town. And it's based off of factors such as race, English isolation, and income. So those are the three factors that are used for the EJ policy. And I believe they're kind of taking a look at that definition and maybe updating it with some census data. I don't have a specific timeline on that, but for now we're using what has been determined to be the definition through our office. So that is, that's that. And then we also have climate vulnerable populations that we talked about a few times. That definition is based off of a definition in our SHMCAP, and it includes things like low-income folks, those without access to transportation, those with different physical mobility levels, things like that. So if you have populations that meet those criteria in your town, please describe those people to us, and that can also be included in that question. There's sort of a subset of points. The top tier is for EJ, and then also climate vulnerable.
Thank you, Kara.
Oh, and our toolkit about
yes.
Environmental justice and equity goes into all of that. So definitely check out that toolkit. I think that will be really helpful in describing all of this to you.
Awesome, thank you. We have a question about the National Flood Insurance Program's community rating system, and if the development of a program for public information would be eligible for an action grant. I would, again, this also sounds pretty specific, so I would again encourage you to contact your regional coordinator about that. But more generally speaking, our projects that are in that planning capacity building category absolutely can include public education campaigns, programming, really in-depth outreach that looks at similar issues to that program, as long as there's a climate change lens to it, climate resilience lens to it. We had a question about the RMAT tool, and will you be able to use that tool for projects that are not for MVP? Can I pass that question to Kara or Michelle, who have more background in the RMAT tool?
Yes, anyone will be able, it will be publicly available on Resilient MA in early March.
Excellent. Let's see. Someone did ask about what a FEMA HMP is. So some of our acronyms that we throw around a lot. HMP is a hazard mitigation plan, and these are plans that are overseen by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and so they are required in order to receive any funding from the FEMA. So this is something that's under the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency, MEMA. So we do allow for the creation of and updating HMPs alongside of the MVP planning process. However, as an action grant project, that's not necessarily going to be a very competitive project type. But again, I would encourage you to reach out to your regional coordinator. That's kind of been my my line here today. Okay. I'm seeing questions about letters of commitment from property owners for when a project involves private property, as well as a question about projects that involve land acquisition. Is there an RC?
Yeah, for the letter from property owners, I mean, I think we really just want to see that commitment to following through with this project. But if you have specific questions about that, we can see if we can come up with some examples and things like that. So just email your regional coordinator if that applies to you. What was the other one about land acquisition?
Yeah, what are our requirements and evaluation criteria for projects that involve land acquisition? In our RFR, there will be specific language about what we are looking for, and we do mirror other EEA land acquisition.
Yeah, you do need an appraisal. There's some town meeting language related to the conservation in the long term of the land. But those specific requirements will be outlined in the RFR. And if you need more information beforehand, just let us know.
Excellent. I believe that is it. I believe we've made our way through these questions. Again, if more things come up, please reach out to us.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. Looks like we're going to end 10 minutes early, which is awesome because it's such a beautiful day. I hope you guys can all take a few minutes to go outside today. But again, if we didn't answer your question, maybe it got lost in the fray a little bit, just email your regional coordinator and we'd be happy to follow up with you. But we look forward to seeing all of your applications this round. So thanks very much.